Medieval Hebrew manuscripts are the most precious witnesses of the Jewish past. And sometimes they are the only witnesses of the Jewish past. The Jewish cathedrals, as Colette Sirat has put it at one time. These material artifacts inform us about the society which produced them. They can be really used as historical sources. Of course, the historians prefer to study the text, what is written in the book. However, the book itself, the artifact, the material object, its archaeological dimensions, so to speak, are also a source of important information that we can study. And in recent years, with the increase of interest in the materiality of the text, the domains of codicology and paleography, the study of the book as a physical artifact became fashionable and important. One of the physical elements of the book is its writing, its script. The study of the writing, of historical writings, of the writing of the past, is called paleography. As a historical discipline, paleography was founded in the 17th century in France by Jean Mabillon. First, it was applied to Latin and Greek manuscripts. Of course, already in the Middle Ages, scholars and judges were interested in the script, but it was used in legal contexts, in forensic contexts, for instance, to discover forgery and uncover forgery. As historical disciplines, the study of paleography to date and to localize the manuscripts, to situate them in the context of production, date already from the early modern period. And for the Hebrew manuscripts, we have to wait much longer. In the 19th century, with the birth of Wissenschaft des Judentums, of course, there is an interest in Hebrew manuscripts. In bibliography, we have great scholars such as Moritz Steinschneider, who is the first one to work on the material aspects of the manuscripts, while he catalogued enormous collections of manuscripts. However, the scientific study of the Hebrew script as such, this little separate part of the manuscripts, although the manuscripts have always to be considered as a whole, but you know, when you study them for pedagogical reasons, you can dissociate different aspects of the manuscript. So when I talk about paleography as a separate discipline, it is purely for pedagogical reasons. So paleography as such, the study of the script, Hebrew script, dates only from the 20th century, mid-20th century, with Salomon Birnbaum, who was the first one to establish systematical charts of Hebrew script. And in the 1960s, Colette Sirat in Paris and Malachi Betarier in Jerusalem founded the Franco-Israeli Hebrew Paleography Project. This project, which continues until today in both countries, has a very important aim: to create methodology and tools, including corpora of texts, in order to develop paleographical study of Hebrew manuscripts. One of the main achievements of this project, of the Israeli part of the project, is the creation of the database Svardata. This is a database of all the dated manuscripts. I will explain to you immediately what it means, dated manuscripts. We are going to come to that. So the script itself, the paleography, this very visual aspect of the manuscripts, can be studied from different points of view and with different aims in mind. We can study the script in order to understand the writer that we are going to call scribe, copyist, or scriptor. There are different terms that you are going to find. We can study his work, his cognitive aspect. We don't know much about the scribe, but still, when we study, when we observe the manuscript, we can follow his work for a certain amount of time, although he lived 1,000 years ago. So there are cognitive aspects to this work. The study of the script can be a part of a more general book history. However, the most important, I think, today part of paleography is the one which is maybe less exciting than cognitive, anthropological, or book history aspects. This is the script typology. Putting different kinds of Hebrew script in categories which will allow us to guess or know, to find out, or find out through a scientific methodology when the manuscript was written and where the manuscript was written. So typology is the part of paleography which allows us to date and localize a manuscript. Of course, some of the manuscripts contain an information about when they were written. Scribes, not always, but sometimes, the scribe write this information at the end of their work, at the end of the copy, in a special inscription in the manuscript, which is called a colophon. Unfortunately, only 3,500 Hebrew manuscripts, codices, books, codices, the manuscripts in the form of the book, like the book today, which is composed of quires of writing material bound together. So only 3,500 codices contain a date, an explicit date by the scribe of when the manuscript was written. They are all included in the Sfardata. In addition, there are about 3,000 documents. And all these are a small part, a small proportion of all the preserved Hebrew manuscripts. We have about 60,000 codices from the Middle Ages, extant today. They are still a very small part of what was written in the Middle Ages, but this is what we have in libraries and collections around the world. And we have about 350,000 fragments from the Cairo Geniza and from the so-called European Geniza, from the European bindings, and the documents preserved in various European archives. So what do we do when we study a manuscript and it does not contain a date? And here, paleographical typology is extremely important. Although it has methodological problems and paleographical work is not a strictly scientific method which will certainly give you a precise date of the work of the scribe, but it can help to situate the manuscript in time and in place. And we are doing it through proposing different categories and trying to compare the undated manuscript with the dated manuscripts which look alike. And in order to do it, we are going to develop specific methodologies, and we are going to talk about them presently. The study of paleographical typology is the study of a comparison. We compare the manuscripts which are undated, which are unknown, to what we know, the dated manuscripts. Our aim today is going to learn how to observe the manuscripts and find pertinent features of these manuscripts. When we are faced with a page, with a manuscript page, we realize that there are many interesting elements on the page. However, not all these elements will be important, pertinent for paleographical typology, for making a difference between different types of script, putting the script into categories, or even differentiating between different scribes. In order to work on typology and learn how to observe and ask the right question, we need to introduce a few terms and few observations. First of all, we are going to differentiate between script and handwriting. The rationale behind paleographical research is that scribes who work in the same place at the same time, and especially the ones who went through the same process of education, are going to write in such a way that the script shares common features. That's our basis. And in order to finding these common features, we can find the group of the scribes, not the individual scribes, and through them, the context where the manuscript was produced. Of course, we need to consider other elements like codicology, the composition of the book, its writing materials, its layout, as well as ink, pigments, and the text which is copied in order to make a really informed decision. However, the script is an essential element, and today we are going to focus on script. The scribes working in the same context, historical context, cultural context, have usually a very similar education. In the case of Jewish individuals, we know that little boys went to school to learn how to read and write at the age of 7. We know about the methods that were used to teach how to read and write from literary sources, but especially from dozens of fragments of the Cairo Geniza, which were once children's primers, exercise books which were written by teachers for the children, to help little children to learn how to read and write. In these primers, the teacher would make an outline of the letter, and the students will fill this outline, usually with colored inks. They were learning not only the shape of the letter in order to recognize it in a book, especially Sefer Torah, because the main aim of this learning was to learn how to read and to be able to participate in Jewish liturgy. All little boys had to do it. So the aim was not only to recognize the letters, but through tracing them, to learn what we are going to call the ductus. The ductus, the dynamic way the letter is made, the number and the order of strokes which are used to trace the letter. However, despite the fact that the scribes may train in the same context and try to imitate the models, because what the teacher gives to a child is a model to follow. So the child at school is going to learn a specific way of shaping his letters. When, after the basic education, a person decides to become a scribe, he will train further on. And here the Cairo Geniza helps us again. We know how the scribes trained. They trained by copying many, many times sometimes the writings, sometimes the colophons or the pieces of the books written by other famous scribes of the past. So the training is based on the imitation of the calligraphic models. And the ideal is to reproduce the models as closely as possible. And this model entity is the type. This is the typological entity which puts together the products, the performance of a group of scribes working in the same context and sharing common characteristics which come from the education and training. However, we know it from our schools, even when we all train in the same context, our performance is not going to be identical. Because even when the scribes train with the same with the same teacher, every person has a very different cognitive and visual capacities, and also the motor capacities. Not everyone is an artist. Not everyone has the capacity of drawing the lines or making artistic drawings. It depends on the way our brain works, on our perception of what we see. Looking at a manuscript, actually, every one of us sees something slightly different. We have different eyesight. Our brain interprets the image in very different way. And then, when we try to reproduce the forms, the connection between our brain and our hand works differently from one person to another. So that even when we all try to reproduce the models we were taught at school, what we actually write is extremely individual. This is what we are going to call the handwriting. The handwriting is what every person actually writes. And of course, these different handwritings of different people will share some common features if people trained in the same place, but they will be also distinctive. We are going to be able to differentiate between different scribes working in the same place, even in the same family, because, as Colette Sirat has said, handwriting is as individual as fingerprints. So this is extremely important to point out. There are as well some useful terms that we will use today during this lecture, and I would like to introduce them immediately now. Paleographers use very different terminologies and different methods. There are very few Hebrew paleographers today, but each one of them has his or her individual approach. What I'm going to present today is an approach that I use myself, which is based on the achievement of such paleographers like Colette Sirat or Edna Engel, but uses as well a forensic method, which is called the SHU method, Standard Handwriting Observation and Evaluation Method, that I have adapted to the Hebrew script. The advantage of this method is that it follows first the global approach to the writing and only later studies the details of the script. This method that I am going to shorten very considerably today will allow us to pick up the most pertinent feature of every type of the script. The terminology I am going to use, the most important terms that I am going to use are the terms of the line of writing, which is a completely abstract, imaginary line that as a paleographer I draw, not on the manuscript, in an imaginary way between the top and the bottom of the body of the letter, of the line. The top line is going to be called the headline, and the bottom line will be called the baseline. These top and bottom lines, headline and baseline, exclude ascenders, like with the letter of the lamed, and descenders of such letters like kaf, final kaf, final pei, final nun, and final tzade. We are going as well to talk about the body of the letter, which is the part of the letter which is included between the headline and the baseline. We are going as well to talk about particular strokes of the letters. Let's take the letter bet, the upper horizontal stroke of the letter, the base of the letter, and vertical strokes that we are going to call downstrokes. Additional small strokes, especially on the upper horizontal bar, are going to be called serifs. We are going as well to use some imaginary terminology, such as foot of the letter tav, head of the letter nun or gimel, arms of the letter shin or ain, nose of the letter pei, and so on and so forth. We shall talk about the form, static form of the letter, which means the shape of the letter as we see it. And we are going to talk about the ductus of the letter, that means the dynamic way the scribe wrote the letter. We are going to examine the angle of the writing, which is the angle of the baseline, the headline, and the downstrokes towards the line of writing, the baseline and the headline. We are going to talk about the ligatures, that means writing two letters without making a space together, as well as about a nexus, which is a special type of ligature, where two letters are written in such a way that they become one sign which loses parts and identity of the separate letters. Like Aleph Lamed in Hebrew, it's a nexus because Lamed and Aleph are only partly preserved in this final form. We are going as well to talk about serifs, as I already said, small additional decorative elements. We are going to talk about shading, or to use an Italian term, chiaroscuro, which is the difference between the width of particular strokes in a letter. Very often, horizontal strokes are traced with the full width of the writing implement, which can be a reed, calamus, or a quill, a feather, a bird feather, while the vertical strokes can be very thin. Thanks to the work of the Hebrew Paleography Project, Franco-Israeli Hebrew Paleography Project, we are able today to differentiate 6 different cultural zones of production of Hebrew manuscripts that correspond to the different cultural zones, regions of the Jewish diaspora. We talk about Oriental, Sephardi, Yemenite, Italian, Ashkenazi, and Byzantine typological entities of the Hebrew script. These are large geographical entities. They encompass huge amount of Jewish individuals, large spaces, region. The Jewish settlements of the diaspora in the Middle Ages go from the Chinese border in the east to Western France and Portugal in the west, from England in the north to Yemen and India in the south. So we are talking about an enormous region, enormous part of the medieval world. And of course, we are talking about the time of about 1,000 years, the medieval period. Through this time, there are differences within these big geographical and cultural zones. Of course, we can still differentiate the manuscript belonging to Sephardi or Iberian type, or Ashkenazi or North European type. However, there are going as well to be smaller entities within, let's say, for example, the Oriental manuscripts. We are going to make a difference between manuscripts written in the places which belonged once to the old Byzantine culture and empire before the Muslim conquest, like the land of Israel and Egypt. And a very different script was used in northeastern provinces of the Muslim world, in Iraq and Iran. There are differences between Ashkenazi script written in Germany, or in France, or in northern Italy. It is very difficult sometimes to trace these very small, finer developments, but with a good paleographical methodology and the number of works that are growing today, the students working on particular groups of manuscripts, in a few years we will be able to have a clear idea not only about these large groups of paleography, but about a much finer differentiation. And we are going to be able to work more efficiently, not only to attribute a manuscript in general to Ashkenazi zone or to Sephardi zone, but to a much smaller geographical entities. It must be stated from the start that identifying a script as, let's say, Ashkenazi, Oriental, or Sephardi, sometimes it's not sufficient in order to claim that the manuscript was written, let's say, in Iberia or in Germany. Scribes moved, and also the borders of the geographical regions, as far as Jewish diaspora is concerned, could be extremely mobile. Riots against the Jews, expulsions, or voluntary migrations were extremely frequent throughout the medieval history. Individuals, but sometimes also entire community, changed places. Like this, after, let's say, the expulsion from Spain at the end of the 15th century, the Sephardi script moves to North Africa and Ottoman Empire. But this is not the first time that the script developed in Iberia migrates eastwards. We have different moments in the history where Jews coming from Iberia find themselves, for instance, in Egypt. We can talk about 12th century and the family of Moses Maimonides, who moved in the 12th century with, of course, the Sephardi culture, but of course also with the Sephardi script. And the autograph manuscripts of Moses Maimonides that we find in the Cairo Geniza, the drafts of his own work, are written in a specific Sephardi Western script. However, this Sephardi script, in its turn, was developed in Spain on the basis of the script that was earlier developed in North Africa, in particular in Tunisia, by Maghrebi merchants. We are going to talk about them. And this script was moved with the trading companies and individuals to Spain. So what we see is that we have these 6 large geographical zones, but we have as well to consider them as mobile, not as static identities. But there might be differences of groups, but also of individuals. We can easily imagine, as the example that I have just given of Moses Maimonides, a scribe, a person coming from elsewhere, and writing in a completely different place. What we need to consider as well is the difference of the style or register of the script. Until the 10th century, all medieval Hebrew scripts are of square register. I'm going to use the term register. Another term that can be used is style, or in Hebrew, signon. So the register of the script until the 10th century is the square one. The quality may vary. Some scribes can be very calligraphic in the 10th century, others write in a very childish script. But from the point of view of the shapes of the letters, we can describe this script as square. The square script ultimately derives from the ancient Ashuri square script that was used for Hebrew from the 4th century BCE, and then developed into different types locally. However, in the Middle Ages, in the 10th century, the square script is not the only register attested. From the mid-10th century, not before, in the Cairo Geniza, we have manuscripts which are written in a more cursive, more rapid register of non-square script. It is not just the question of aesthetics. It's not a script which is less beautiful or less calligraphic than the square script. The shapes of the letters and the way the letters are traced is different indeed. We are going to talk about minuscule scripts, and the first attested medieval non-square minuscule scripts are the letters that emanate from the chanceries of the Babylonian Geonim in Iraq. 960, the letters of Nehemiah Gaon are the first non-square medieval manuscripts attested in the Cairo Geniza and elsewhere. This particular script, this register of minuscule script, will spread in the diaspora, in the Jewish diaspora, with the influence of Babylonian Geonim. And we are going to find the shapes of the letters that are first attested in Babylonia all over the diaspora in rabbinic writings and legal documents. We are going now to look at several examples of manuscripts. They all come from the collections of the University of Pennsylvania. The fragments stemming from the Cairo Geniza, the Geniza of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Egypt that were brought to Europe and the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. They all come from Harper Collection, which is housed today at Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies in the library of the center, and we are going to see a few codices that come from the Schoenberg collection of the Pennsylvania University. We are going to start with examples of Oriental manuscripts, the most ancient preserved manuscripts from the Middle Ages. Our first example is a Geniza fragment, Halper 14. It originates from the Cairo Geniza. It is, as you can see, in a very poor shape of preservation. It is probably one of the most ancient manuscripts from the Geniza. It dates maybe as early as the end of the 9th century, the beginning of the 10th century. This manuscript, if you look at it closely, it is written on parchment. You can see a difference of color and texture between the hair side of the parchment, which is yellow, and the flesh side of the manuscript, which is whitish, cream. The manuscript is written in brown walnut ink, and you immediately realize that the Hebrew script is written on the top of another writing. This manuscript is a palimpsest. It was created out of a larger monastic manuscript, a manuscript that was written and used in a Christian library. The original manuscript was in Greek. It was a passage from the New Testament, the Acts of Apostles. The larger leaf of the original manuscript was taken out and folded to create a bifolio of the Hebrew manuscript. That's why the Hebrew manuscript is, of course, smaller than it's the half of the original Greek manuscript, but also the Hebrew script is perpendicular to the original Greek. The text in this manuscript is an early form of a midrash on Genesis, which has affinities with the Midrash Genesis Rabbah. There are two other fragments of the same Hebrew small codex, which are preserved in Cambridge Geniza collections, and they are also written on the palimpsest of the same Greek manuscript. It is possible that the Greek manuscript dates as far back as the 6th or 7th century. As for the script of this manuscript, the Hebrew script of the manuscript, because of course we are not going to talk about the Greek script, I define this script as Oriental of the southwestern category. Southwestern Oriental script was used in the ancient Byzantine parts, in the land of Israel and in Egypt. This particular subcategory of Oriental script influenced as well the Hebrew script that developed in southern Greek-speaking Italy, in Apulia and Basilicata. There were, of course, close contacts between land of Israel and southeastern Italy that are very well documented, and we can follow these developments also following the similarity between the script. Now I would like to focus on the script itself, and we are going to interrogate every single manuscript with a specific set of questions. We are going to begin about looking at the density of the script, the proportions between what we call white and black, between what is written and what is not written, and how the groups of written signs are displayed on a page. We immediately notice, when we focus on this manuscript, that the letters are very well spaced in a word. The spaces between letters in a word are larger than the width of a stroke or the width of the letter Vav. This width between the words is so important that we lose track of particular groups of letters in a word, because the spaces between the words although they are larger than the spaces between the letters, are not coming out. They are not highlighted. So when we look at the lines of the text, we see a sequence of well-spaced letters. The manuscript was written with a calamus, like all Oriental manuscripts we are going to talk about. We are going next to look at the proportions of the letters. The proportions, that means the ratio between the height of the letter and the width of the letter. Focusing on this manuscript, we realize immediately that the letters are square and squat. They are sometimes broader than higher. Some of the letters have proportions which look like ancient Greek letters. Very squat proportions of the letter Aleph makes it look very similar to the Greek alpha. So this is an important element when we study the script. It's to realize what are the proportions and what is the relationship between different parts of the letters. We are going then to focus on the headline and the baseline and how particular letters relate to the headline and to the baseline. Watching this manuscript, when we focus on the top of the line of writing, on the headline, we realize immediately that the letters touch the headline in a spike. The impression that the script gives is that of something sharp, something spiky. The top of the letter mem is a triangle. There are several serifs, you remember, small decorative elements, which are placed on the horizontal strokes that face upwards. All the impression is extremely spiky. We find a very similar impression also with the baseline. The bases of the letters are not sitting straight parallel to the baseline, but are slanted at a certain degree. When I measured it, it was about 25 degrees. So we have very slanted impression of the letters getting to the baseline in a very sharp way. So these are the most important, very general features when we look at the script in a first global vision. When we analyze the letters, we are not going to have time to analyze every single letter, but I will pick up one or two examples for every script of what I consider to be relevant and different, pertinent shapes of the letters. In our Harper 114, a very characteristic letter, which is found in most of the manuscripts on palimpsest in the Cairo Geniza, is the shape of the letter Aleph. When we zoom on the letter Aleph, we can see that its characteristic element is not only very elongated proportions, horizontally elongated proportions, but also the fact that the left-hand downstroke descends from the headline to the baseline in a straight line. And we are going to see how important this element is. At the same time, we realize that the right-hand part, to the right of the main oblique stroke of the letter, is traced like a short stroke parallel to the oblique line. We are moving to the second example of the square Oriental script, the manuscript from the Cairo Geniza, Harper 15. This manuscript was most probably written in Egypt in the 11th century, in the Oriental square subtype that I will call Northeastern. This subtype of very calligraphic Oriental script starts probably in the 10th century. At least the earliest attested dated manuscripts are from the 10th century, and the earliest known manuscript in this particular Oriental subtype come from Iraq and Iran. It is possible that we are dealing with a particularly calligraphic style that developed in the Abbasid Empire in the 9th or 10th century. From that, with the migration of Jewish population from Iraq and Iran westwards to Palestine, to Egypt, to North Africa, this particular very decorative calligraphy moved as well to these western provinces. This is why the manuscripts in the northeastern type are found in the communities that were under the influence of the Babylonian centers in North Africa and in Egypt. This particular calligraphic script was used for decorative Masoretic Bibles. Here we have an example of a small Bible, less formal than the huge Masoretic codices. However, it is also a Masoretic Bible. We can see that the dimensions are small. The text is written in one block of text on the parchment page. However, the text is calligraphic. There are vowels as well as the notes of Masora Parva in lateral margins and Masora Magna in upper and lower margins. So we have a small, less formal, maybe portable, pocket size, but still very decorative Masoretic Bible. When we focus on the characteristics of the script, particular characteristic of the scripts, asking the same questions as the questions we asked of the previous manuscript, we can focus first on the density, and we realize immediately, looking at the manuscript at the first global way, that the words are well-defined units, graphic units within the line. There are large spaces between the words, but very small spaces in the word. A very different approach to the proportion between the white and the black than the previous manuscript. The proportions of the letters are also different. The letters are vertically elongated. They are taller rather than wider. When we move to the headline is very regular. The upper horizontal bars of the letters are well parallel to the headline with very small serifs. If the serifs are written, they exist, but they go above the headline just a little bit. It's not something which is spiky, which points up. The letters are really square, well placed, each one of them in its own place within the line of writing. The baselines as well are relatively regular and almost parallel to the baseline. The ascenders of the letters, of the letter Lamed, are relatively long. In the first line, as you can see here, they are really very long, much longer than the height of the letter. And because, of course, there is the space in the upper margin, so the scribes uses the ascender of a Lamed as a calligraphic element. He goes up to fill up the existing space. However, even within the text, within the lines, the ascenders of the Lamed are long. They are slightly longer than the body of the letter, which is included within the line of writing. The descenders are very interesting. They are also relatively long. They have the length of the height of the body of the letter, except for the descender of the final nun, which is very short and which barely descends below the baseline. And this is going to be a characteristic element of this particular subtype of the Oriental script. This is a pertinent feature of the script. When we move to the shapes of the letters, we realize immediately that there is a possible confusion for the reader between the letter Chet and the letter Hei. When we look well at this script, these two letters are very different. However, we, the modern readers of modern Israeli print, of printed texts, we are used that in the letter Hei, the left-hand downstroke never touches the upper horizontal bar. There is a space between the upper part and the left-hand stroke. in this manuscript, very often, the left-hand stroke touches the upper horizontal bar, like in the letterhead. However, the letterhead is very different because the place of the left part of the letter changes. With the letter hey, the left part of the letter, the left downstroke, moves towards the middle of the letter, whereas for the head, it is attached to the upper bar outside the letter, on the outer part of the letter. So the difference is evident. However, it is not the difference we are used to, because for us, modern readers, the difference between hey and het, the pertinent difference is the space on the left between the top line and the downstroke. That's not what happens with this script. The difference, pertinent difference between hey and het is obtained in a different way. When we look at the letter Aleph, we saw it with the previous document. Here we have a completely different approach to the letter. The left-hand leg of the letter does not descend from the headline, but at some distance from the headline. It descends from the middle oblique stroke of the letter, almost in the middle of the line of writing. It is curved with a foot that faces usually outwards, to the left. The right hand part of the letter, the little stroke to the right of the main oblique stroke, attached to the oblique stroke with a little stroke. Both manuscripts are written with a calamus, but they both are very different. You can see there are some pertinent features of the script that I try to explain which differ. And they differ not only from one manuscript to another, but from one group of manuscripts to another. That's why I think that we can safely consider these two manuscripts as representative of two subgroups of Oriental square script. From the 11th century, from the beginning of the 11th century, the non-square script that developed in the Geonic academies undergoes a major development, notably in North Africa, in the communities that were in close touch with the Iraqi academies and which were under the influence of the rabbinic learning from Babylonia. We have here a manuscript from the Cairo Geniza. It is a letter of a merchant, Salomon ben Moshe ben Isaac from Sfax. He's writing from Mazara in Sicily, where he went on a business trip. He writes to his business partner, whose name is Judah ben Moses ibn Sugmar, and who is at that point in Fustat. It is the longest preserved letter from the Cairo Geniza. It is written on paper by probably another associate of the merchant. We have several letters of both individuals from the Cairo Geniza, so we can follow the development of their own handwritings as well as of their business association and development of their affairs and trade. We are here in the context of the Maghrebi sea trade. The traders from North Africa trade between North Africa, Sicily, and Egypt. The letter written on paper is the longest preserved letter in the Cairo Geniza. We can see that the writer had lots of things to say. So he started at the top. He wrote his letter in a very economic way. He left a margin on the right, but he ran straight and completely to the left edge of the paper. Then he filled completely this long roll of paper with his words. He continued writing as well on the right margin in an oblique way, like a carpet. And then he turned the page. However, for the Oriental writers, turning the page is not a movement a horizontal movement like the one that I'm making, but the page was turned vertically. So the letter continues upside down from what now is the bottom of the recto to the top of the recto, because the page was completely turned up. Usually, in most cases, the letters are not written on the verso, because the verso is used as an envelope for the letter. Here, the scribe left only about 12 centimeters of this very long, more than 65 centimeters long piece of paper in order to write the address. The address is indeed written in Hebrew and Arabic characters on the left blank space on the verso. To be sent, the letter had to be folded. It was folded horizontally into a very small packet of about 3 centimeters. We see the folding traces throughout the letter. So we can see how the letter was made into a small packet in such a way that the left blank space served as an outer envelope and the address was written on the top. The letter contains very important historical information. The writer, as I said, from Sfax, is in Mazara, in Sicily, for business. However, Sicily at that time we can guess from the other documents from the Cairo Geniza and also from the contents of the letter, is about 1064. So we are around the year 1064, and what happens at that time in Sicily? There are Normans that arrive and try to conquer the island. And indeed, in 1064, Normans try to conquer the town of Palermo. And there are echoes of the Norman conquest in this letter. Our writer grumbles about the difficult political situation. However, most of his letter is taken up by complaining about the addressee, the partner, who is making very wrong business decisions, and the writer threatens that he is going to end this partnership. Well, he didn't, because we have other letters from the Geniza, and we see that the partnership continues. So it was a threat, probably to enhance a better performance from the business partner in Egypt. Anyway, they made it up. From the point of view of the script, our interest today, this document is one of the manuscripts written in what I called the Maghrebi cursive. Later on, this type of script is going to be called al-Mu'allaq. This is a highly cursive script developed from the Gaonic Academy's non-square minuscule. However, within the professional group of the Maghrebi merchants, the script becomes something very different. It has a completely new graphic visual aspect, but also it has a very different function. Like the mercantesca, merchant scripts from medieval Italy, this is a specific script which was developed originally for a professional group in order to maintain the networking and cohesion within the group. So when the writer uses this kind of script and someone receives such a letter, he identifies immediately the writer as someone from the same merchants network, trading network. And also it must be said that the script, as befits the merchants, is a professional script. It's quick. The letter is written at a great speed. So the script is extremely cursive. We are going immediately to define what does it mean to write quickly. How can we say that the letter is written quickly? Of course, it has to be written at a great speed because the merchants send their letters with passing caravans or passing boats, and sometimes they don't know when exactly the caravan or a boat will be departing. So sometimes they write really at a great speed. The correspondence has to be done fast, sometimes they write an enormous amount of letter. This is what the Cairo Geniza is showing us. There are archives of merchant houses that found their way into the Geniza. And all of them, from the beginning of the 11th century, although written in different handwritings by different individuals, are written in this very specific cursive script that developed in Tunisia for this specific group of people. So what are the characteristics of the cursive script? First of all, again, when we talk about the density of the script, that's the first criterion. The density is very high. There are no spaces, or very little, but very often there are no spaces between the letters in a word. The letters are written as ligatures. They are attached one to another. The proportions of the letters are vertically elongated to such a point that horizontal parts of the Hebrew letters, as we see them, are often completely eliminated. It is much quicker to trace a stroke from top to bottom than from left to right. This is the normal direction for a right-hand person to trace the strokes. So there is this vertical direction of the script. The headline and baseline are respected. However, the script is rounded. Lots of forms of the letters, instead of being square, like in what we have seen until now in square script, have a very rounded shape. Why? Because in such a way, making rounded movements of the calamus, it is possible to write a large part of the letter with just one movement of the hand. We may think, okay, a movement of the hand of a letter which is 3 millimeters high does not take a long time. But when you trace a stroke from top to bottom, then you detach your hand, your writing implement from the parchment or paper. Then you go back by an invisible line or movement which does not leave the trace back to the headline, and then you trace again going to the baseline. It makes you one additional movement. In a letter as long as this, it will take you 10 minutes longer. It's very, well, I'm saying 10 minutes, I haven't measured it, but indeed, adding these small additional movements can make a huge difference. So the script is elaborated in such a way that these additional unproductive movements are almost completely eliminated. In the same way, when a letter ends at the baseline, the next letter, instead of going back, like usually in the square, more calligraphic script, to the headline, the letter will start at the baseline as a continuity of the same movement. This is why, as we are going to see when we zoom at the text, some letters are written as a ligature. The letter hey, for instance, at the end of the word or a syllable, when the previous letter stops at the baseline, is written as a loop and resembles completely the Arabic letter waw in the way it is traced. Like this, the scribe does not need to go up and trace the letter hey, which can take as many as 2 or 3 separate strokes. It's just one loop attached to the previous letter. So the shapes of the letters change. The hey is not the usual hey that we imagine, upper horizontal bar, right hand downstroke, left downstroke, but it is simply a loop. There are other forms of the same letter, hey, it's called allographs. We find 2 or 3 different forms of the same letter written by the same scribe in the same document. However, we rarely find the forms which require a large number of strokes. The number of strokes is reduced. This is why in another allograph of the letter hey or in the letter kof, once the scribe traces the part placed in the right-hand part, the lobe of the letter kof, or the upper and right-hand part of the letter A that he traces as one movement, in order to attach the left-hand part, which normally we expect should start at the top, at the headline, he attaches this part to the lower extremity, to the lower tip of the right-hand movement. So he doesn't need to pick up his pen. He just continues. But while he does it, the shape of the letter is completely different. He has obtained a different letter. So we are faced here with a script which is quick, ligatured, and because the scribe writes so fast, he obtains the shapes of the letters which were not attested in Hebrew script before. But these shapes and the same idea about linking the letters are going to be attested later, because the North African, Tunisian, Maghrebi script, as we see it in this letter, will be developed in Iberia, in Spain, and will become the traditional cursive, but also the so-called semi-cursive or minuscule or bookhand script in Spain. Indeed, the Iberian Peninsula, just like North Africa, was a part of the Muslim Maghreb. The contacts between North Africa, Iberian Peninsula, but also with Babylonia, with Iraq, are well attested in the 10th century or even earlier. We are going, therefore, to move to the Iberian Peninsula, and we are not surprised that the type of the square script that is attested, and we are using here Halper manuscript 88, which is a Babylonian Talmud written on parchment. There is as well a difference of color of the parchment, cream colored on the flesh side and yellow on the hair side. So we are using Halper 88 Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Yevamot. Only a part of the page is preserved. We are going to observe this manuscript, and when you have a closer look at the page, you realize that this manuscript once must have been a binding of a book. There are traces of the folding of the book, as well as on the flesh side, traces of a cover of a leather that was glued and attached to the manuscript. It is not surprising that the manuscript, the script of this Iberian manuscript, has some points in common with the square script of the northeastern type, because, as I said, there were contacts between Iberia and Babylonia. As for the dating of this particular fragment, we can compare this Talmudic manuscript to manuscript 19 from Hamburg collection, which is also a Babylonian Talmud, specifically dated to 1184 and written in the Catalonian town in Catalonia in Girona. We have probably a Catalan manuscript from northern Iberia, written during the last quarter of the 12th century, so probably very contemporary. We immediately observe the page layout of this Talmudic manuscript. The text is written in one block of the text. There are no parallel columns of the text. It is one block, and in this block, the Mishnah is introduced by larger characters, an abbreviation matni for matnita, the Aramaic for Mishnah, in the blank parts of two lines. So there are larger characters to introduce the subdivisions of the text. As far as the script is concerned, we have here an example of extremely pure, very easy to read, square calligraphic script. It is, when we have a look at the density of the letters, there are spaces between letters in a word and larger spaces between the words. The proportions of the letters are elongated, vertically elongated. The letters are slightly taller than wider. However, generally speaking, the proportions of the letters tend to be a square. So slight preference for verticality, but normally we are dealing with a square. There are very little additions, like serifs. The letters respect the headline and the baseline completely. So the upper horizontal bars are perfectly aligned with the headline of the line of writing, as are the bases that are sitting clearly on the baseline. So obviously the downstrokes are almost completely parallel to the headline and the baseline. The descenders of the letters are relatively long, and this concerns all the descenders, including the final nun. We saw that it was not the case in the Oriental script, but this is certainly the case in the Sephardi square script. The nun and the other descenders are almost the same, treated in the same way. They are longer than the body of the letter. The ascenders of the lamed are also equal to the height of the letter. The characteristic features of the script include the aleph, which, like in the Oriental script of the northeastern type, so Babylonian or Abbasid type, has its left-hand part, which begins from some distance from the top. It's nicely curved, like a knee, with a foot which goes towards the left. The letter P as well is very characteristic and also reminiscent to the same letter in the Oriental northeastern type, where the letter does not have a clear horizontal stroke which is parallel to the headline, but meets the headline in a triangular way. Two strokes, the right-hand downstroke and the left-hand downstroke finished by a nose, meet at an angle towards the headline. These are the characteristic features of this script, which is in addition extremely pure and easy to read. Similar characteristics are found several centuries later. The Sephardi square script is very normative, very conservative. That's why we find similar forms of the letters, the ones that we found in the 12th century, in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century manuscripts. The next example that we are looking at is the manuscript still from the Cairo Geniza, Halper 5, which is a Bible manuscript containing the text of Genesis. The manuscript is of a simple character. It contains the vowels in addition to the calligraphic square script. However, it does not contain Masoretic annotation. It does not contain the Masorah Parva or Masorah Magna. This is therefore a less calligraphic, non-Masoretic codex of the Bible. It is written in 2 columns per page. It's a parchment manuscript with the hair side, which is yellow, and the flesh side, which is different from the hair side, but still of a cream yellowish hue, which is characteristic for Sephardi manuscripts. As I said, the script itself is very conservative, so we can talk about the proportions of the letters, which are square, the respect for the headline and the baseline, the strokes, horizontal strokes, being completely parallel. However, with time, the script develops an even more square characteristic. When we look closely at the letter, such as letter Mem, the letter is almost completely square and almost closed. It's really very different from the previous periods. However, the general characteristics of the script remain the same. In addition to square scripts that we have just seen, 2 non-square registers of script developed in Iberia, in the Iberian Peninsula. One that we are going to call minuscule or semi-cursive, or Beinoni, middle one in Hebrew, and a particularly cursive script, which is reminiscent of the Maghrebi North African merchants cursive. Both of these scripts can be used in documents and can be quite cursive, and both of them can as well be used in books and develop decorative calligraphic bookhand. The example of the calligraphic bookhand of semi-square script is manuscript 57 of Schoenberg collection of the Library of University of Pennsylvania. This manuscript contains several astronomical works, including over 100 astronomical tables. Among these works, there is a series of tables and astronomical discussions by Jacob ben David ben Yom Tov, written in 1361, as well as several works by Abraham ibn Ezra. Some of the tables contain as well the correspondence between Jewish and Christian calendars. There are names of saints of the Christian calendars whose form, linguistic form, is Catalan. So we know both from the script, from the codicological aspects of the manuscript, but also from the text and the contents of the text, that the manuscript was probably written in Catalonia. As for the date of writing, of course, it couldn't have been written before 1361, because one of the texts was composed at this date, and one of the calendars contains the date of 1391 for Perpignan. So it is quite probable that the manuscript was copied around 1391. The manuscript is beautifully illuminated. It contains, in addition to the text that I have just mentioned, a book, a Hebrew version, of course, of the Book of Fixed Stars, which was written originally by a Persian astronomer in the 10th century, the astronomer whose name was Abd al-Rahman as-Sufi. His catalogue of stars that we have in this particular manuscript is particularly beautifully decorated. The manuscript was therefore written at the end of the 14th century, somewhere in Catalonia or Roussillon, around Perpignan. It was probably produced in a workshop because the manuscript is written by 3 different scribes, all of them using very similar style of handwriting, but still same type of script. However, the handwritings are different. There are as well 2 other manuscripts which were probably produced in the same workshop, and one of the scribes is probably even the same. One of these manuscripts, also, of course, a similar type of astronomical text, is in Vienna, and the other one is in Braginski collection in Zurich. As for the type of the script, we have here a perfect example of calligraphically used semi-cursive Sephardi script. Its main characteristics contain very rounded aspect, general aspect of the script. As for the density of the script, it is very high. The spaces between letters in a word are very small. The letters touch each other in the word. The spaces between the words are much larger, in such a way that when we look at the page, the words as graphic units come out, are highlighted immediately. This is a very characteristic element of this script. The headline is very regular, as is the baseline. However, many letters are rounded, so the bases of the letters such as kaf, bet, touch the baseline in a rounded way rather than a parallel straight line. Some of the letters, such as the letter P, is however longer than the baseline. The letter that we don't expect to, as far as our modern readership of Hebrew is concerned, we don't expect this letter to go below the baseline. The letter P is particularly large and goes below the baseline. The descendants of the letters are relatively long as is the assembler of the letter lamed. Another characteristic feature of this particular script register and type is the shape of the letter hey, whose left hand downstroke goes below the baseline again and is curved at the bottom to the right. Sometimes the letter can be confused with the letter kof, although the kof is longer. The center of the kof is longer. The characteristic shape is also the letter aleph. The letter aleph, the shape of the letter aleph, is originally based on the kappa-shaped aleph, like a letter K, short k, that was introduced for the first time in the non-square script of the Babylonian Geonim in the 10th century. That's when the kappa-shaped aleph appears. Then it spreads, as I said, all over the diaspora with non-square scripts, rabbinic scripts, but in every place it receives a specific calligraphic or less calligraphic form, characteristic to the place. In the Sephardi script, the letter aleph in the semi-square script is traced like the letter chet. That means that the left-hand stroke goes straight from the headline to the baseline, but the right-hand part of the letter, which originally looked like a Greek kappa, like a K, is different. The lower part of the right-hand part is rounded and goes up to the headline and descends straight to the baseline in a rounded arc. The top part of the right part of the letter goes above the headline. So the aleph is written like a het within the line of writing, with a part going above the line of writing. This is a characteristic feature, the shape of the letter aleph, which is found across manuscripts in this particular script type. An excellent example of a Sephardi cursive script used as a bookhand, as a calligraphic script used to copy books, is manuscript 229 of Schoenberg collection. It is a scientific manuscript. It contains, it's an average size, it's on paper, and it contains a commentary of Averroes on categories of Aristotle and on Porphyry as well. The type of script, as well as watermarks in the paper, indicate Catalonia or southern France, Provence, the second half of the 15th century. So we have a relatively late manuscript from the end of the medieval period. However, the type of script that is used in this manuscript goes back in its characteristics, although here it's very calligraphic, to the Maghrebi script as developed in North Africa in the 11th century. In the previous manuscript that we saw, it was from the Cairo Geniza, it was used to write letters, business letters. Here it is used to copy books. So of course, it is more calligraphic. However, there are very similar characteristics to the script. These characteristics contain vertical elongation of the letter, disappearance in some points, in some letters, of the horizontal parts. The letter lamed is particularly elongated. We have as well the shapes of some letters, like letter aleph, which originally is as well kappa-shaped. However, in the cursive scripts, it tends to be written with just one stroke, one wavy stroke. So we find it in the 11th century, in the Maghrebi cursive. We find it as well in the cursive scripts of Sepharad, south and north. The most characteristic script of our manuscript is that the headline and the baseline are not very strong visual points of reference. There are lots of cases, as you can see, of what we can call nesting. By nesting, I understand the phenomenon when a base of a letter underlines the following letter or two. So the following letter nests on the previous letter, which allows, of course, to squeeze the letters within a word, but at the same time, it can give a very decorative element, which was particularly strongly exploited in Spanish manuscripts. At the same time, at the level of the headline, we have a very similar phenomenon. We are not going to talk about underlying, but or nesting. We will talk about, let's say, sheltering. A letter, like letter tzade, for instance, can shelter by its upper part, like a roof, the letter which was written before it in the word, in such a way that the letters are like a puzzle, getting sometimes one within another, which means that some letters are longer, going above the headline, and some letters, in order to fit into this very regular and very calligraphic way of placing the letters in a word together, can be very short. For instance, the letter nun is not final nun, just regular medium nun, is usually very short. It doesn't go to the baseline, it stops in the middle of the line of writing. With the next example, which is Halper collection, 4 fragments, 91 to 94, we are leaving the realm of Muslim empire, and we are moving to the Christian lands. We are moving to what we call Ashkenazi lands, the places where the Jews lived, north of Alps, in France, England, Central Europe, Germany, up to Eastern Europe, and in northern Italy. This particular kind of script, the square script which developed in Ashkenazi lands, is attested probably in France for the first time in the 12th century. The earliest manuscript written in what we will call Ashkenazi script is a Talmud preserved in Florence. It is dated. It was written in 1177. However, the Ashkenazi script springs or develops out of an older script attested in Christian Europe. This is the Italian script, whose manuscripts are attested as early as the last quarter of the 11th century in southeastern Italy. Graphically speaking, from the point of view of the shapes of the letters, we can see that the Ashkenazi script is indeed related to the shapes of the square Italian script. However, it is written with a completely different instrument. For the first time today, we are dealing with the manuscripts that are not written with a reed calamus, but rather with a quill, with a feather of a bird, which usually was a goose, but not always. The manuscript that we have in front of us is a fragment of the Talmud, of the Babylonian Talmud, which was written according to the script as well as the quality of the parchment, white, smooth parchment, around 1300, so end of the 13th or the beginning of the 14th century. The most characteristic features of these fragments, as you can see, these are pieces of the columns of the Talmud that were cut out of the manuscript in a very regular way. Normally, Ashkenazi manuscripts from the 12th to the end of 14th century are written in 2 parallel columns per page, just like Mishnah rabbinic manuscripts from Italy. We saw a Talmudic manuscript from Sepharad. It was written very differently. It was written in 1 block of text per page. Here with the fragments, of course, we can't see the columns on the page. However, we see very narrow columns, so we know that there were at least 2 columns per page. And since we know that Talmudic manuscripts in the Ashkenazi world were written in 2 columns per page, so probably there were 2 of them. This is when we have to reconstruct the manuscripts from the fragments that we have. As far as the Ashkenazi script is concerned, we are going to talk about two different square scripts used in Ashkenaz. One of them, a simple one, is used for Talmudic and rabbinic manuscripts. It differs from the highly calligraphic script that is used for Bible manuscripts, as well as beautiful display marzorim and sidurim, prayer books. There is, I think, a very clear functional distinction, the association of a subtype, sub-register of the square Ashkenazi script with the text that this script is used for from the 12th to the 14th century at least. So what we are facing here is the Talmudic square register of the Ashkenazi script. First of all, we have to make sure that the use of the quill allows to obtain specific forms of the letters which would be very difficult to obtain with a calamus. These forms are additions of the letters, and when we look closely at the script, we realize that the script, the Ashkenazi script of our manuscript, contains elements, decorative elements, which are called a bifurcation. I'm going to call it a fishtail, the horizontal strokes, and by a bifurcation which really looks like a tail of a fish. So let's call it a fishtail. Some downstrokes contain a thickening in the middle that we are going to call a drop shape, and there is a very strong chiaroscuro, very strong shading, the difference between thick and thin lines, thicker horizontal lines, and much thinner vertical lines. The most characteristic features of the Ashkenazi Talmudic square script are the proportions which are relatively elongated. The letters are longer than wider, and also a relative aspect of sharp endings. The script is relatively spiky. When we look in the first general vision, global vision of the manuscript, we realize that manuscript is full of little serifs and endings of particular strokes, downstrokes, that point sharply upwards. It is very similar to the Gothic Latin script, where the minims, that means the downstrokes, end sharply upwards towards the top. And the same graphic feature is reproduced by Jewish scribes. It doesn't look maybe exactly like the Latin script, but it contains lots of features, of the visual features of the contemporary Gothic Latin script. This is why when we talk about Ashkenazi script of the 14th century, we can talk about the influence of the Gothic features on the work of the Hebrew scribes. So the fragments that I am showing here are examples of the Talmudic square Gothic Ashkenazi script. Other Gothic elements contain decorative endings, for instance, of the flag of the letter Lamed, where we have two spikes coming out of the flag on the top of the letters ascender. The bifurcation, the fishtails, concerned horizontal upper strokes as well as the basis of the letters. As for the basis of the letters, there is as well an element of a slant, of a triangular, angular aspect, because the basis of the letters are at a certain angle to the baseline. So they are not parallel to the baseline, square, but rather slanted. So that the letters, unlike the Sephardi square that we examined before, cannot be really inscribed into the shape of a square or a rectangle, but rather of a lozenge or even a triangle. So we have a very different general shape of the letters. A characteristic feature of the Gothic Talmudic square Ashkenazi script is the feature that we are going to see very clearly in a moment, which is called the biting. In many cases, in Talmudic manuscripts of the Ashkenazi type, but also in some rabbinic Italian manuscripts, as well as in a few Geniza fragments of the southwestern square type still in rabbinic manuscripts, we have the letter Aleph, which loses its left-hand downstroke and employs the following letter, is glued in a way to the following letter to maintain its right-hand part. I call it biting. The letter Aleph bites into the second letter. It loses its part and it's attached to the following letter. This is in a way like a nexus or a ligature. We are used to the nexus. We spoke about the nexus of Aleph and Lamed, the two letters coming together. In this type and register of script, the Aleph can bite not only into Lamed, but also into other letters, such as Yud, Tav, Resh, Mem, Samech, Hey, and so on and so forth. And this is a very characteristic element of this script that we can see very clearly in the Halper manuscript. Non-rabbinic square script from medieval Ashkenaz is very different indeed. The script used in Bible manuscripts, as well as in display Marzorim and Sidurim, the prayer books, is extremely calligraphic and contains slightly different features than the script used in Talmudic manuscripts. Our next example, and a perfect example of a calligraphic, non-Talmudic square script of Ashkenazi world, is Cut Center RAR manuscript 477, which does not come from the Cairo Geniza. It is a fragment. However, this fragment was probably reused for a binding of another book, as indicated by the folding of the manuscript. The parchment, extremely gray, whitish, clear, and very similar on both sides, as well as the careful ruling of the manuscript, which was done with a pencil. We can see the traces of the pencil, together with the script and the format of the manuscript, which must have been much larger than the fragment that we have, because the fragment is not completely preserved. The upper part of the leaf is missing. All these elements indicate Germany at the end of the 13th or very beginning of the 14th century. The script, unlike the Talmudic script, that was triangular and spiky, it's much more rectangular. The German manuscripts tend to have the proportions of the letters rather elongated, taller than wider, and German manuscripts in particular, not really French, but German manuscripts, respect the baseline and the headline in a very strict way. We have, therefore, the upper horizontal bars, which are parallel to the headline, the bases, which are parallel to the baseline. We have Gothic features, some Gothic features, but they are much more discrete than in the Talmudic manuscripts we have just seen. We are going to have a drop shape thickening in the descenders of some of the letters or in some of the downstrokes. However, they are not very frequent. So the features appear, but not with the same frequency as in the Talmudic manuscript we have just seen. There are as well some elements of bifurcation. The fishtail appears on some of the letters. However, it is much less prominent, much less visible, much less spiky than in the previous manuscript. The letter Aleph, and this is characteristic to both sub-registers of the square Ashkenazi script is traced in the way which is reminiscent, and we go back to the Oriental script again, of the southwestern type of Oriental script, the first manuscript that we saw together. That means the left-hand downstroke of the letter Aleph goes straight from the headline to the baseline. It finishes with a foot, and it starts exactly at the upper left extremity of the medium stroke, main stroke of the letter. This is a characteristic feature of the Ashkenazi Aleph, but also of the Italian square Aleph, and also, as I said, of the Oriental of southwest subtype. So it is possible that this shape of the letter follows as well what we know about cultural transmission between Palestine, Italy, and Ashkenaz. The fragment that we have here is vocalized, and we remark that the titles of new prayers and the beginnings of new subsections are written in very large, decorative, beautifully calligraphic characters. In addition to square register, Hebrew manuscripts written in Christian Europe can also be written in a different register of script that we are going to call minuscule or semi-cursive. From the 15th century onwards, an even more cursive script develops. This script contains features such as kappa-shaped aleph that bring us back to the original non-square scripts as developed in rabbinic academies in the East. It is difficult to claim that this script came directly from Iraq. However, it must be said that the non-square registers of the script in Ashkenaz developed mainly for legal documents and rabbinic texts related to the development of the interest in the study of the Babylonian Talmud. So, like in Spain and other parts of the Jewish diaspora, there are probably contacts between the East and the Christian West, which account for the similarity of this particular script that developed indeed as a script of the legal documents and rabbinic texts. The non-square Ashkenazi script is attested in Western and Northern Europe for the first time in the 12th century, and this is in medieval England. However, a script which is graphically very similar to what we find later on in 12th and 13th century England appears in Catalonia in legal documents from Barcelona from the 11th century. So there are two possibilities to interpret this similarity between purely graphic similarity between the non-square script from Catalonia and Northern Europe. Either we consider the Catalonia that was a part of the Charlemagne's empire as culturally related to the north, or we consider that in the 11th century and before the influence of the Sephardic cursive, simply non-square scripts were based on a more general rabbinic Koine script, which was spread in Spain, in North Africa, in the East, and also slowly up north in Northern Europe. So there are two possibilities, and for the time being, it will be very difficult to follow the development of this script. What is important to stress is that from the 12th century, a non-square script develops for legal documents, and from the early 13th century, it is also used to copy books. Some informal books are copied in a non-square script with lots of cursive features. This is the case of our Geniza fragment 109. Other fragments from the same parchment manuscript that we can see. So again, we have quite a strong difference of the color of the parchment, yellow on the hair side and whitish cream on the flesh side. The manuscript is written with brown gallnut ink, gallnut iron ink. Other fragments of the same manuscript are found in other Geniza collections. So we have indeed one of the big mysteries of the composition of the Geniza collections. We have an Ashkenazi manuscript that comes from the Cairo Geniza. The manuscript here is a commentary, it's a Talmudic commentary, which has not yet been identified with precision. So we have a version of a commentary. There are some similarities to the commentaries of the French Tosafists. However, it is not precisely the text that we know from other sources, other manuscripts, or printed books. So Talmudic commentary, probably French or borderline with Germany. The manuscript itself was written probably at the very end of the 13th century. The development of the script is the only way we can date the manuscript. First of all, we realize, comparing non-square Ashkenazi script from the 12th and 13th century, that there is a development in size. Usually the size depends on how much space the scribe has, whether he can write leisurely, large letters, or on the contrary, he tries to squeeze his letters to spare writing space. However, in the medieval Ashkenaz, we get an impression that size for non-square, non-display manuscripts really diminishes in a very consistent way in legal documents and in books from the third quarter of the 13th century. In the 12th century, we find manuscripts written in non-square script which are as tall as, let's say, 4 millimeters. At the end of the 13th century, like the case of our fragments, 2 millimeters or less is the norm. This is a very, very frequent size of the manuscripts. Maybe it has to do with the invention of the spectacles, because indeed, when you have a closer look at the manuscript, it is indeed very small and very difficult to read. So if such a large amount of manuscripts was produced in one particular place, the readers must have been at ease with reading such a small script. The characteristic features of the script contain the proportions which are quite squat. The letters are not vertically elongated, they are rather square. The shapes of the letters are rather rounded. The script contains cursive features, such as letters hey or het, whose right part is written in one stroke. So there is clearly the diminishing of the number of the strokes to trace the letters in such a way that the letters are written quicker. Of course, the size of the letters, of course, as well means that the letters are written in a much quicker way. However, there are almost no ligatures. Unlike the cursive scripts of the Sephardi world, where the rapidity of the script was based on linking the letters, writing them together, here the density of the text is on a balanced side. That means there are spaces always within a word between the letters. There are no ligatures to speak of. The most characteristic shapes of the letters include the letter Aleph, which is kappa-shaped, and as we know, for non-square script, the kappa-shaped Aleph appears for the first time in the letters of the Babylonian Geonim in 960s, in the 10th century, and then it spreads in non-square scripts all over the diaspora, including the Ashkenazi world. The most important element in reading Ashkenazi non-square documents is a possible confusion between some forms of the letters. Resh and Dalet can be written interchangeably. Dalet, which is more angular, and the Resh, which is written in a rounded way, very often in the manuscripts, the scribes don't pay really attention to make a difference between the two letters. As well, the aleph, the kappa-shaped aleph, sometimes can be written in a detached way, in such a way that it looks very much like a yud followed by a vav. So reading the non-square Ashkenazi script can be sometimes difficult. This is not the case of this manuscript, which, although the letters are very small, has a very, very good legibility and is really, it is really a scholar's hand, a commentator's hand. However, the manuscript is very easy to read.